All right, let's see. Are we in business here? Are we in business here? Well, we are live. Everything seems to be working. Just trying to get the sound sorted out. Okay. Oh, I think this will work. We're just going to, I suppose, sit tight for a few minutes while we get going. Now, we did our secret society, if you will, did one of these live streams before because we can't have the secret meetings because of the whole virus panic situation. And so we're trying it again. And last time it went pretty good. Was pretty happy with the whole thing, so it's been a while, but let's give it another try here. Now, let's see, what are we doing here? So, yeah, we're just waiting for a few minutes. Looks like some people are coming on in. That's cool. We do have the chat box, which I will use to perhaps interact with folks a little bit. And also, let's see, people can ask questions and things as we go. We'll try and take a few pauses along the way and check the chat box. Let's check the chat here now. Some people are saying hello. Yeah, okay, so, yeah, we're having a good time. We're going to talk about Marxism. And we're going to do our best here. It's one thing I learned in the last stream is that it's pretty challenging to talk to a screen by yourself for a long time. In person, it's much easier to give a presentation. This whole thing's kind of weird. It's kind of like being a radio host in a way, and that I think is actually a pretty hard skill because you have to speak coherently pretty much continuously for quite a long time. And I don't know, it's not easy necessarily. Now, if I talk too slow for some of you, then you can always come back and watch the video later. It's going to be saved forever, just like the last one. The last live stream about the virus panic, that's there forever too, so you could always check that out if you hadn't watched it. Does anyone in the chat box there go to the secret meetings? I want to see if we have some familiar faces in there, because we might have some people who have never been to the secret meetings. Anyway, just want to kill another minute or two here and then have get going with everything. Hope everyone's doing well. Hope the virus panic isn't driving you too crazy. One of our friends in the chat box asks if we're in Calgary. Yes, I am in Calgary. I am in a basement in Calgary. It's kind of cool down here. But yeah, if you're talking about forbidden things like Marxism, it's good to be in a basement. Somebody asking, what is the secret meeting? Well, this is loosely associated with a certain meetup group. And I assume that's where you probably might have heard of it, but I don't really know. Anyway, yeah, let's talk about Marxism a little bit here. So, people toss the word Marxism around a lot. This guy's a Marxist, that guy's a Marxist. But sometimes it's just a poorly used word. We want to get kind of back to basics, talk about classical Marxism today and why it's terrible. What are its fundamental mistakes? We don't want to nitpick the little things. We want to just kind of go to the core and see why it's refuted. So, yeah, basically, I want to start with a good old quote from our good friend Murray Rothbard. He said, "There is one good thing about Marx, and it's that he was not a Keynesian." So, Marx was a real economist. He wasn't just some guy. He did serious economics work. He just wasn't necessarily all that great at it, much like Keynes himself, another extremely important but extremely bad economist in terms of the effect that he's had on the world. Now, for Marx, I mean, Keynes is maybe the only economist worse and more destructive than Marx. So Rothbard tries to, be fair, give him a compliment here and there. He's not as bad as Keynes. Then again, maybe is, depends on your interpretation. So why do we want to talk about Marxism anyway? Is it relevant? Does it matter? Is it kind of like a zombie philosophy or zombie economics? And the truth is, classical Marxism isn't necessarily well represented in its pure form anymore. But a lot of its ideas have kind of stuck their twisted knives into people's brains, and that has persisted over the generations, long past the glory days of Marxism. And of course, you might hear about things like, say, there's all these Marxist professors in the universities. And you might think about, how is that influencing people, these self-described Marxists or Marxist sympathizers teaching your college students? Well, some people think about that, and that's pretty interesting. So there might be some Marxists out there that make it interesting to talk about. You might also see these, Marxist street gangs kind of running around sometimes, chanting Marxist kind of slogans like, we have nothing to lose except our chains and things like that. Perhaps groups like Antifa, who seem to be kind of communistic or anarchistic. And, you might have heard about some other things like, it's been reported that the leaders of like BLM, for example, are trained Marxists, supposedly. And that might be true, or maybe they think they are, but there's a sense that Marxism's kind of still out there in some way. And we have our own communists in Alberta here. This is the Young Communist League from University of Alberta. And kind of a funny looking bunch, not so threatening. But they might think they're Marxist in some ways. They're probably espousing some kind of Marxist ideas. And I know we shouldn't make fun of people for the way they look, but they are kind of funny looking. It's a funny looking bunch. And a funny sidebar, there was a study from a few years ago where they said people on the right tended to be better looking on average, and then by implication people on the left are, I guess, less good looking. And you can think that, if you're better looking, the world might treat you a little better in some ways. And if you're on the left, maybe in that sense, you're treated a little more poorly. And that might kind of steer you towards a more egalitarian or communist tendency. I don't know, I guess that's just kind of pop psychology stuff. But something to think about, because there's definitely the observation we can easily make that it seems like a lot of these so-called communists and Marxists, a lot of them are kind of funny looking. I don't know what's up with that. So who cares about this anyway? There's some Marxists running around. Are they really Marxists? I don't know. But John Maynard Keynes himself, not necessarily a great economist, but sometimes a man of wisdom, he kind of spells it out here, where he says, practical men who believe themselves to be quite exempt from any intellectual influence are usually the slaves of some defunct economist. Madmen in authority who hear voices in the air are distilling their frenzy from some academic scribbler of a few years back. And I guess what that means is a lot of these ideas we sometimes think of as old ideas, maybe obsolete ideas. They still exist. They've kind of trickled down, if you will, trickled down ideas, and they've kind of seeped into the consciousness that goes along with certain ideologies and such. So Marxism, like I said, you might not see a lot of classical Marxism anymore, but a lot of those ideas, whether they've been kind of modified or adopted or transformed in some way, they're still important and they're still relevant. Even a lot of people who say they aren't Marxist, they're relying on a lot of Marxist presuppositions, you could say. Now, as we're getting into this, as Rand might say, state your premises. So I just want to kind of say where I'm coming from in a very simple way. Although you don't necessarily need to accept the following propositions to kind of go along with this. The criticisms can in some ways stand on their own. But just to say where I'm coming from, first of all, the market allocates resources most efficiently. And by efficiently, I mean most effectively serving the needs and wants of the consumers. Secondly, the value of economic goods comes from the subjective preferences of consumers. So that seems obvious, but part of the conflict with Marxism is Marxism follows the classical economic goal of kind of finding the objective determinant of value, like the objective thing that's there that explains a price, for example. It was a later innovation where it was a later innovation in economics where you started seeing it from kind of the subjective consumer standpoint rather than looking for that objective factor. Now, finally, when it comes to the production of wealth, there's basically only three ways that happens. Appropriation, and that's, you could say, homesteading, which is when you appropriate or basically acquire or act upon a good that has never been within the sphere of human action and choice. So it was not an economic good before, but your action kind of brings it into the economic world, so to speak. It exists economically at that point, and that creates an economic good. That is wealth. Then you can produce something, and that's basically transforming an economic good into a more valuable economic good, like taking a raw material and turning it into like a finished manufactured product that serves a consumer. That's another way you increase wealth. The third way is exchange. Very simply, two people agree to trade goods because they value the other person's good more than what they have. So in both cases, their well-being improves because they're both getting something in exchange for something that is less valuable to them. All this is kind of important going in, but like I said, you don't necessarily need to accept these particular propositions, although it's very likely if you're watching this, you probably do. But I'm just putting it out there, laying my cards out on the table. Okay, now we're going to get into some Marxism stuff here. First of all, I'm going to do a shot of vodka. Why not? Because if we drink a little bit of vodka, there's a chance we might get a little bit angrier. And if we get a little bit angrier, we might have a little bit more fun. On the other hand, if we drink too much vodka, we could become incoherent, and that might make things less fun. So we'll just have some fun here, see what happens. Cheers, everybody. Now, let's see. Do we have any other chat action? Right on. Someone says, not so threatening on the surface. I think with reference to our friends in the Young Communist Party of Alberta. Their ideas are dangerous. They might not look dangerous. Interesting point. Okay, Marxism. So if you want to go back to kind of like core Marxist theory, not like some of the essays and more the polemical stuff, but Marx's economics, you would go to Das Kapital. Basically 3 volumes. The third one's kind of like whipped together from what was left over. And that's where the real economic theory comes in. Not so much, the Communist Manifesto, although that explains a lot of the underlying philosophy. But remember, this is an economics study. Marx was an economist. As I said, there were some changes with Marxism over time. People tried to work out different problems with it, but a more modern version of pretty classic, orthodox Marxist economic theory is Ernest Mandel's book. And, I mean, it's okay, but the thing is, he was pretty diehard Marxist, and he stuck to the program pretty good, and it's a little bit more of a modern book. Still old. It's probably from 30s or 40s, I think. I don't remember off the top of my head. But that's the kind of stuff we're looking to for our sources when we talk about this stuff. But before you even kind of come to that point, you are needing to think about the philosophical environment that Marx came out of, just to set the groundwork and understand why he kind of gets off to a false start from the very beginning. In the middle of the 1800s, continental philosophy was basically completely dominated by the thinking of Hegel. And Hegel, whatever you think of him, whether you think he's garbage like Schopenhauer, or whether you think he basically kind of fixed up a lot of Immanuel Kant's problems and added a lot of interesting things of his own, whether you think he's associated with, some of the worst political trends or whatever. He's definitely one of the greatest philosophers of the 19th century, at the very least in terms of his importance. There's no Marxist system really without Hegel. But the thing is, at this time that Marx is writing, the whole scene was all about Hegel. Anyone who was trying to talk about philosophy kind of had to talk within the Hegelian framework. And otherwise you just, you weren't cool, you weren't with the times. There's no reason to really listen to you at that point. So Marx is kind of in this situation too. He kind of comes out of the Hegelian system, but he doesn't like the Hegelian system as applied to the way Hegel did. He takes it and kind of perverts it in a certain way that really doesn't work, and it gets the whole project off on a metaphysical basis that is pretty much impossible. So Hegel, just very crude, basic overview. He was an objective idealist or absolute idealist, and that's as opposed to a materialist. So basically, consciousness is the fundamental stuff, very simply, and material matter is not, whereas materialism is going to put matter as kind of the fundamental thing that exists, and might deny that consciousness even exists at all or whatever. So for Hegel, this is a pretty different way of thinking, but for him, logic, metaphysics, ontology, it's all basically the same thing. And so thought and reality, or thought and its object, or subject-object, it's all the same stuff. It's all the same stuff that can be in a mind. There's no difference between kind of what's out there and what's in your mind. So for him, the only real thing is Geist, which is like spirit or mind or consciousness, you might say. And material things are not for themselves. They're not fully real. But Geist or spirit is fully real. Now, this doesn't seem important, maybe doesn't seem interesting. And Hegel's got this incredibly arcane system, incredibly difficult to read, and books that are just technical in the sense that they're really kind of using the language that was dominant at the time. To kind of illustrate how the whole Hegel thing works, we'll take a really crude example, and Hegel would never explain it this way, but I just want to give you kind of like the most abstract sense of what he's talking about. Because Marx takes this. This is the dialectical process. You may have heard of the Hegelian dialectic, and you may have heard of Marx's dialectic materialism. So we just want to understand that a little bit here. And contrary to some misunderstandings, the Hegelian dialectic is not... It's not a method to find truth or anything like that. It's basically a description of the necessary process of the spirit forming like the perfect idea of reality, like the absolute ultimate thing in itself, so to speak. Now, just illustrate kind of this process, again, because it's important for where Marx is going. Let's say you're constructing knowledge, because for Hegel, knowledge or understanding is like a ladder. Like, it's not different pieces. It's like you move up the ladder and you get closer and closer to ultimate reality. Now, at the very bottom of the ladder, you have the ultimate abstraction, which is being. That doesn't really tell you anything about anything. It's like existence exists. That doesn't really have any interesting content. This idea is kind of negated by nothing. So if existence exists is basically useless or basically meaningless, then perhaps its negation is correct, which is nothing. But that's just equally abstract, kind of has the same problem, like nothing doesn't really get you anywhere. And the resolution between these contradictory ideas, the sort of synthesis of them, is becoming, and that's where the road begins. That's where kind of the motion of thought begins on its path to ultimate knowledge. Again, he would explain it probably better, but this is just a basic idea, because what we're trying to understand here, no matter what you think about this, this is 100% incompatible with any kind of materialism. So what does Marx do? Well, he comes up with dialectical materialism, where he takes the Hegelian system and tries to apply kind of the materialist view to it. So the way the mind in Hegel advances from inferior thoughts to more complete and perfect thought, Marxism's theory of history is that, the different economic systems move through this kind of ladder up to the ultimate communist utopia. And you have a given economic system which determines its negation, so to speak, and the resolution of that leads to the next economic system. So you can illustrate it like, in this diagram we have empire, for example, and then the conflict is with barbarians. The resolution of empire versus barbarian, you can say, is the landed aristocracy. This leads to the conflict with the bourgeoisie, and the resolution between the conflict between the landed aristocracy and the bourgeoisie, which are the capitalists basically, is bourgeoisie democracy, which leads to the conflict with the proletariat, which is the working class. And the resolution of capitalism versus the proletariat is proletarian rule and the development of, your communist paradise. So the metaphysics at the very basis of Marxism don't work from the very beginning. But to make this work, Marx needs a very specific kind of economic theory to spell out and defend this theory of history and show why it's necessarily true. So now we want to look at the economics behind this, and that's where the contradiction really emerges. It's a problem that he's taking Hegel's ideas and applying them in a way that literally is impossible. He's really just playing with words, so to speak. Engels did this a lot too, his sometimes co-writer and benefactor. Engels had this one essay, for example, where he's kind of applying the thesis, antithesis, and synthesis process to like biological processes, and it's just silly. It's like a guy who did too many drugs and he's like thinks he's come to these great, enlightened, interesting ideas. So economics. With this Marxian system, it's important to note that the economic system itself is determining the course of history. It's not people deciding the economic system, it's the economic system deciding the people. And he says the base is basically the material productive forces, the economy, that determines the superstructure, which is kind of the culture, the family situation, religion, etc., etc. Now, of course, this might seem pretty counterintuitive. You might think, no, the society, the culture, or whatever, that determines the economy. And there were some communists who thought this as well. So, for example, Antonio Gramsci, possibly one of the most important communist thinkers after Marx. Little sidebar here. Antonio Gramsci is basically where we get what is often called cultural Marxism. He was a communist leader in the 20s, and then he was the fascists put him in jail in the 30s. And he wrote a lot of theoretical work that was critical of this kind of old Marx orthodox theory. He said that religion and culture were the base of the pyramid, not the economic relations. So that's not Marxism, because Marx says instead that the modes of production are at the center of social development. So the base for Marx is the economy. The base for Gramsci was, culture and religion, basically. So Gramsci put this whole ethical and subjective dimension on a higher level and rejected materialist theory of the Marxist and Leninist ideology. And so cultural Marxism, as it's often called, is kind of a misnomer. It's actually a kind of anti-Marxism, or you could say post-Marxist leftist ideology of some kind. There's not really a quick catchy name for it. Cultural Marxism, we kind of understand what people mean when they're talking about that usually, but it's important to note that what we think of as cultural Marxism sometimes, which we're not going to really talk about today, that is not really consistent with Marxist theory about how history progresses and how to change society. Just an interesting sidebar. So the Marxist theory of history, again, this is the key. This is what he's trying to prove, and he needs his economic theories to do this. But one thing I learned from Hans Hermann Hoppe is that the Marxist theory of history, you can say it's pretty much basically correct, but the problem is it kind of gets off on this false starting point, and it brings the whole thing down. So intuitively, we can kind of understand what he's saying. His theory consists of a few key points. The first of which is that history is basically class struggle. It's exploiters versus exploited, the rulers versus the ruled. He says exploiters want to maintain their relationship and the exploited do not. And it's about the class you're in, the modes of production determine the class you're in, and the class you're in determines the way you think. It's kind of like different kinds of logic, different kinds of thinking depending on the social class you're in. He talks about how history is really determined or influenced by relations of production, and there's something to that. Property and ruling class and state, that's the relationships there are clearly important for how things go. Then what he says is each stage is going to result progressively in the concentration of power within a ruling class, and then ultimately it hits the limit of exploitative rule. Like the parasite can't get so fat that the host dies completely, and then you kind of kick into crisis mode, and then you get the change. All of this is pretty intuitively reasonable, and if you have kind of a libertarian or classical liberal basis for thinking about class, like the rulers versus the ruled and such, and you kind of look at a lot of things that are happening around us now, a lot of this is basically seems kind of correct. So where does he go wrong? Well, it's all in this theory of class and who is the rulers and who is the ruled. Who is exploiting who? We're going to talk about that next. I want to check the chat box. I have a sip of water here. Now, I have a plastic straw for my water. That's going to be illegal in Canada soon. So stock up if you want your plastic straws. All right, chat box pretty quiet. Not much going on there. Now, yes, so in this kind of first idea of Marxist theory of history, you have, kind of the familiar idea. You might think bourgeoisie and proletariat, or the capitalist, is exploiting the worker. But he doesn't really start there, and we can go along for the beginning. I mean, he talks about the master versus the slave. Obviously, that's a relationship of exploitation. The master is exploiting the slave. No problem there. And we can also go along with Marx when he's talking about the feudal lord exploiting the peasant. The peasant produces stuff, the feudal lord's kind of a bad guy, and he takes the peasant's stuff, much as the master and the slave relationship was. I think we're on board so far. The next one is the capitalist system, the worker versus the capitalist. Capitalist is exploiting the worker, just like the master was exploiting the slave. But here's where we start to wonder, does he have it right? Is this like the master versus the slave? Is this an exploitative relationship? Well, Marx offers a plausible explanation. He says factor prices are lower than input prices. Okay, what you're paying your wage to your worker is less than what the goods are sold for in the market. And so, say I'm paying $100 to my worker to produce some goods, but then I, the dirty capitalist, am selling that for $125. I'm pocketing the $100 or the $25. The worker is not getting the full value. And it's this surplus value that is expropriated by the capitalist. So the worker is exploited. And it's easily represented in the equation, in the image you see there. You've got the value produced by the labor, and then you've got the exchange value of the labor power, which is more, yes, it's more. That surplus value, that difference, is the profit, and the profit represents exploitation. Again, very much the way the slave was not able to keep the full value of his labor. I mean, he might get some oatmeal once in a while, he might have a shack to live in, but he's not being treated well. He's being exploited. And Marx says it's very much the same with the capitalist and the worker, and this is why. Like I said, this is plausible. And if maybe you're a compassionate person and not cold-hearted like myself, you might be sympathetic to this because it seems like it's looking out for people who are on the short end of a stick. But economically, this is actually a total disaster. Marx kind of sums it up here. The directing motive, the end and aim of capitalist production is to extract the greatest possible amount of surplus value and consequently to exploit labor power to the greatest possible extent. And Marx talks about this a lot in Das Kapital. To his credit, he looks at some crony corporations and some of the state-chartered trading companies throughout history that are kind of mixed up with, different colonial mess and some of that bad stuff. He's not necessarily wrong about all of that. But the question is capitalism inherently exploitative? Is that relationship necessarily one where some person benefits and another person loses? This is part of the key here. Now, economically speaking, we might answer this question as to whether capitalism is inherently exploitative by wondering why the worker would ever agree to that. So there's actually a mutually beneficial trade in the capitalist process. The worker is trading the final product of labor, which comes later basically, for present goods, which are his wage. And the capitalist is trading the wages now for the future goods later. He's making the capital investment, he's paying the worker, and later he hopes to get more. Whereas the worker doesn't make the capital investment, doesn't have to wait and hope he gets a higher product or a higher price. He gets paid now. So there's no wait, no risk for the worker. The capitalist does wait, and he does have the risk because of his capital investment. So both parties are benefiting there. It's basically trading present goods for future goods. Now, a lot of people will think that, waiting isn't valuable in and of itself. And I mean, that's just not true. And it goes to a core idea in economics, which is time preference. And that's where we get interest. That's why there's time value of money. And we want to distinguish between what an economist might call originary interest versus profit. So technically speaking, and I don't want to make it too confusing, but in kind of equilibrium state, there's still waiting, there's still time passing, and there's still interest. But profit and loss doesn't exist in that case, because profit and loss is kind of like a form of error that you're constantly trying to correct. Profit means you didn't pay enough for your inputs, your input factors, and loss means you paid too much. And there's a constant adjustment process to fix that. So in, kind of the optimum equilibrium economy, or the equilibrium state, not necessarily optimum, but profit and loss aren't there. Interest is. That time factor is still there. And that's because no matter what, acting man, or a human that's choosing, prefers more goods to fewer goods, and he prefers goods now to goods later. A pie now is better than a pie in 5 years. $100 now is better than $100 in 5 years. But $100 now might not be better than $500 in 5 years. So that's what interest is basically representing. It's the time value, the fact that you can only get a future good traded against your present good at a discount. That's why there's the surplus value that Marx is saying is exploited. It's not exploited. The time is, in essence, representing a service. Waiting for it, you need to get paid more, so to speak. Now, Hans Hermann Hoppe, who was a former Marxist himself, he kind of explains what happens if you interfere with this kind of natural, harmonious process, or really any of the other ways of creating wealth that we mentioned at the beginning, which were appropriation, production, and exchange or trade. Hoppe says, under a system of socialized production, quite contrary to Marx's proclamations, the development of productive forces would not reach new heights, but would instead sink dramatically. For obviously, the capital accumulation must be brought about by definite individuals at definite points in time and space through homesteading, producing, and or saving. In each case, it is brought about with the expectation that it will lead to an increase in the output of future goods. The value an actor attaches to his capital reflects the value he attaches to all expected future incomes attributable to its cooperation and discounted by his rate of time preference. If, as in the case of collectively owned factors of production, an actor is no longer granted exclusive control over his accumulated capital and hence over the future incomes to be derived from its employment, but partial control is instead assigned to non-homesteaders, non-producers, and non-savers, the value for him of the expected income and hence that of capital goods is reduced. His effective rate of time preference will rise. There will be less homesteading of resources whose scarcity is recognized and less saving for the maintenance of existing and the production of new capital goods. The period of production, the roundaboutness of production structure will be shortened and relative impoverishment will result. To sum that up, civilization requires this capital formation and this incentive to build up more capital. Humans start with no capital. They start with themselves and some land, basically, and they can't do too much. Labor is extremely limited. But once you add capital goods, like machines, tools, basically anything that's used to enhance your ability to produce consumer goods, that's how you get wealthier. That's why our civilizations are prosperous. We have this huge capital stock. And Hoppe is saying that if you interfere with that process, you diminish the production and maintenance of your capital, and of course you'll become more impoverished as a result. So that's a bit of a problem for Marx, but Marx isn't done with us yet. He's really committed to this idea. And the way he's going to show it is, regardless of what we've just said, he's going to prove that this exploitation happens, and he's going to do it with the labor theory of value. So remember, when you're talking economics, there's three different factors of production. There's labor, there's land, and there's capital. But as I said, you don't really start with capital. You start with labor and land. Those are the original factors, and then you can make capital from that. You need nothing before you can have something, basically. And Marx is saying here that the discrepancy between the input and output prices is exploitation. So it means the capitalist is exploiting someone. And it has to be the laborer, the landowner, or both. But since Marx is saying only the laborer is exploited, not the owner of the land, he needs the labor theory of value to really make this happen, make this work, make his theory of history kind of come together. Like I said, Marx was a real economist, and he wasn't some screwball out of nowhere. He really thought, quite reasonably, that he was just following the steps of the other great classical economists, basically in the footsteps of Smith, David Ricardo. The next step is in that natural progression is Marx, and in a lot of ways that's true. Murray Rothbard said something like that in his economic history books. So Marx was making kind of a contribution in this field, and it was labor theory of value. It all comes down to that. And he's building up on the mistakes of Ricardo, especially. Like I said near the beginning, kind of the fundamental problem with classical economics, or at least one of the big problems, was that they were looking for this what would you say? They're looking for this objective measure of value and explain why prices are what they are. And the idea was that the costs determine the price. It was the marginalist revolution, as it's called in economics, where they turned that around. They kind of solved this problem, and they said prices determine costs, based on the theory of marginal utility, which you might be familiar with. But that's the correct path. Marx is following the wrong path. He's trying to come up with an objective determination for the price of the costs going into what is determining the price. Marginalist revolution, a bunch of guys kind of came to the same conclusion at the same time. Karl Menger was the coolest guy, of course, obviously. Theory of diminishing marginal utility, very simple if you're not too familiar with that. Basically, to illustrate, 3 eggs is more valuable than 2 eggs. 2 eggs is more valuable than 1 egg. 1 egg is more valuable than the second egg you get. The second egg is more valuable than the third egg you get, and so on. And this kind of goes into what is determining the price. It's the consumer valuation. It's these interacting value scales that people have. The second egg is always going to be worth less than the first one because you're necessarily applying it to your less urgent need. My first egg, I'm going to eat it. The second egg, maybe I'm going to give it to my friend. Not too important, just something to think about. But in order to show that capitalism was inherently self-destructive, Marx can't go in this direction. He needs this labor theory of value to work. And he's following up on Ricardo's labor theory of value, which is basically labor is the determinant of value, because capital itself is nothing more than kind of frozen labor, as he would say. Frozen labor in the form of a capital good. To Marx and the classical economists, there were no subjective factors determining value. So this labor value that Marx is committed to, it has to be somehow objectively embodied in the product itself. And he thinks he proved this. So let's see what he says. Let us take two commodities, for example, corn and iron. The proportions in which they are exchangeable, whatever those proportions may be, can always be represented by an equation in which a given quantity of corn is equated to some quantity of iron. For example, 1/4 corn equals X hundredweight iron. What does this equation tell us, he asks? It tells us that in two different things, in 1/4 of corn and whatever number hundredweights of iron, there exists in equal quantities something common to both. The two things must therefore be equal to a third, which in itself is neither the one nor the other. Each of them, so far as it is exchange value, must therefore be reducible to this third. And he's saying the third, of course, is the labor value. That's the objective thing that is determining these prices, these exchange values. Marx really did think he proved this. But immediately we can see, even just on an intuitive level, it doesn't seem like it can possibly be right. And we can start with like just kind of a silly example where you have a mud pie, which might take a lot of work and meticulousness to get just right. Then you might have a tasty apple pie. Might take the same amount of work, the same labor units. But clearly one is going to be tasty and desired by people, and one is not. So despite the labor involved, they're not necessarily going to be getting the same price. We can see it's pretty obvious that maybe labor isn't the factor there. Maybe it's how much people want it, or maybe it's how tasty it is, or something else, but not labor units. Now, there's a critical error in the whole beginning with this idea that these prices are representing some kind of equality. Really, exchanging something does not mean that they are equal and represented by an equation. Otherwise, why do the exchange at all? Obviously, if I'm trading something, it's because, not because I think the thing I'm giving up is equal to the thing I'm getting. I think what I'm giving up is worth less than the thing I'm getting. That's why I trade. You can think of the old philosophical example of bird and's ass. And the idea is, you have this ass, and you put them between two buckets. There's food and there's water. He wants the food and the water equally bad. He can't decide between them. They're exactly equal on the value scale. He's paralyzed between them. Does he die? Can he ever make a choice? That's the question. What that illustrates is that the trade itself isn't really about equality. It's about different people valuing things differently. But if there's no equality in value, that means there's no third something to which these values must be equal. So there's no objective, labor unit or whatever. But Marx is a tricky guy. He has some different ideas. He thinks he can get out of this. And he brings up the idea of socially necessary labor. Well, it's not just labor itself. It's the socially necessary kind of labor. Don't you see? The thing is, he basically defines socially necessary labor as that which is connected with the value. The apple pie, like we said, it has more value than the mud pie, which it turns out doesn't really have any, or at least very low. So Marx is begging the question, why is it that the apple pie has lots of this value and the mud pie has little or none? The labor theory doesn't seem to explain that itself. And socially necessary labor, well, that's kind of the same thing. Isn't the answer that the apple pie has socially necessary labor and not the mud pie because people like to eat the former and not the latter? Isn't it a subjective value issue? That should be obvious, but Marx rejects any kind of subjective determinant of the price. But then Marx's argument is circular in doing so, because we can never know what is socially necessary or not unless we're looking at those consumer values. He's caught in this kind of little cycle here. You need a more Austrian explanation of price or more marginalist explanation. What this means when the labor theory of value falls apart is that the model of capitalist economics that Marx provides doesn't end up working and leads to a fundamental contradiction that brings the whole thing down. Remember, he says that profits are derived from exploiting labor. So that means profit rates or returns should be necessarily lower in heavily capitalized rather than more labor-intensive industries, because you can exploit a guy, but you can't exploit your tractor. But here's the thing, economists up to this point, for the most part, and including Marx himself, recognized that this was not how the markets actually worked. The rates of profit, or that originary interest, like that time factor, so to speak, tend towards equality in all industries. So some industries aren't systematically making more profit through exploitation than others. They're all tending towards the same equal rate of return. To get an intuition behind why that is, and perhaps if anyone watching this has done like a introductory corporate finance course or like economics, might seem obvious, or the explanation just might be sitting with you already, but the idea is, for a given level of risk, the market's going to converge on one rate of return, because if you're invested in something that's not earning a lot of money, so say something below this blue line here on this graph, then you're going to shift your resources into other industries or other opportunities that are making a higher rate of return. And what this does is this creates a reaction where you reduce factor prices in those previous industries, so you increase the rate of return in the area you're moving out of, and you bid up the factor prices in the industries you're moving into, and so kind of squeeze those rates of return. So the tendency is constantly to move towards the same rate. And Marx acknowledged this. This was a classical economics thesis. Marx agreed with it, and he found himself with his labor theory of value coming up against a problem where these propositions can't go together. Marx said if the real world profit rates tend towards equality, that would necessarily mean that the real prices or exchange values in capitalist markets do not exchange at their quantity of labor values. Again, otherwise you'd have their systematic difference in kind of labor-intensive versus capital-intensive industries. So how could Marx solve this problem that he acknowledged? Because if he couldn't, his system was in a lot of trouble. Von Bauwerk, who wrote one of the great criticisms of Marxism, he said, Marx himself became aware of the fact that there was a contradiction here and found it necessary, for the sake of his solution, to promise to deal with it later on. But the promise was never kept, and indeed could not be kept. So we're getting to the climax of the situation here. I'm just going to check in on the chat box. I see a familiar face. Yeah. Yes, we're having a good time in the live stream. And remember, you can always come back and look this up. If you have any questions, drop them in the chat box. If you're enjoying a drink or a snack, well, maybe have a sip or a bite. I think we're having a good time. So Marx is dealing with a big contradiction here. If he doesn't fix it, he's screwed. Basically, rates of return tend towards equality. But he's saying the labor theory of value is true. And if that's true, then there should be not equal rates of return in the economy because of different kinds of industries that use more or less labor. Marx promised to solve this problem, and he kept mooching off Engels and never really devised a real solution. Marx was kind of a bum. He needed Engels, who had a lot of money, to kind of finance his lifestyle and his writing and his work. And Marx said, yeah, keep the money coming. I'm gonna solve this problem in Das Kapital Volume 3. And Marx fans, they eagerly awaited the solution because no one could think of one. Like, it was just baffling. And Engels, in kind of this sneaky trick, he held a contest where he invited people to write in what they thought Marx's solution was going to be to this problem. Everyone was very excited in suspense, and some people had theories about ways you could get around it. No one in the contest could figure it out. And of course, the cynical person might think, well, maybe they were trying to crowdsource the solution to a intractable problem that they stumbled across. By the time Das Kapital Volume 3 was actually put together and came out, Marx offered no solution at all to this contradiction, and he just defaulted back to the old Ricardo theory of kind of a variant of the labor theory of value, which was that the classical idea that costs of production plus the average rate of profit determine the exchange rate or the price. Not that it was just labor units or whatever. Basically, he kind of accidentally abandoned the labor theory of value. Von Boverick was the main person to level this criticism in his big critique of Marx's economics, which was Karl Marx in the Close of His System. It was detailed technical refutation, and it carried a lot of weight with professional economists, and it lost a lot of, or it cost Marxism a lot of its serious credibility as an economic system. Eventually, even Marxist economists would abandon orthodox Marxism, specifically the part that depends on the labor theory of value, despite all these failed attempts to rehabilitate it with different writers over the years. And Otto Bauer actually just scrapped labor theory of value because this was such a disaster. Now, while this was very influential among economists, it didn't have a lot of influence among, kind of the softer social sciences like historians, sociologists, philosophers, the literati, etc. And you can kind of see the effects of that today. Some people aren't into those screwy economics. They're building their theories in other ways, and they don't care if there's a technical refutation of a Marxist idea. Let's review what this contradiction is very carefully. What is this contradiction that we're saying brings down the Marxist economic system? Marx claimed that the values of goods are determined by the quantity of labor units needed to produce them. We're going to call that Proposition 1. That's the labor theory of value, basically. But he also agreed with the classical economists that rates of profit tended towards equality in the market. And we'll call that proposition number 2. The problem is this. If proposition number 1 is true, then the rates of return would be systematically lower in proportion to the higher capital investment and higher in proportion to their labor intensiveness. Again, you might say, I can exploit people working for me, but I can't exploit a machine. I can't exploit my drill press or my excavator. We'll call this proposition number 3, which is implied by proposition number 1. Now here's the thing. If number 3 is true, then number 2 cannot also be true, and thus we have a major contradiction in the Marxian theory, a contradiction that Marx never resolved. The problem is the labor theory of value is garbage, and we know it's garbage because it creates a contradiction where one of these propositions has to go. And the labor theory of value is on much weaker ground than the idea that the rates on the market tend towards equality. So Marxism, not much good. It sucks. And contradictions make Aristotle sad. This is Aristotle. He doesn't like contradictions. You can't be going around accepting contradictions. Marxists are problematic this way because they often do. Some people think, that's just bourgeoisie thinking, or that's just the oppressor colonial way of thinking. But there really is no thinking without accepting the law of contradiction. And when you've got a contradiction in the very core of your economic system, you screwed up pretty bad. We call this a headshot in the realm of intellectual inquiry. Basically, we just, took a sniper shot and blew the head off Marxist economic theory here with a fundamental contradiction that brings it all down. And wow, we're actually all done. So in conclusion, Marxist economics is bad, and therefore Marxist theory of exploitation is bad. And therefore Marxism is bad. So you might not have a lot of orthodox Marxists running around, but you have a lot of people who are very influenced by the Marxist theory of exploitation, which kind of comes out of that old economic theory. Labor theory of value is maybe not specifically expressed, but it's kind of below the surface of a lot of the ideas that you hear. Although again, we're kind of in this weird post-Marxist world right now where the exploiter and exploited class, it's kind of transformed a little bit, and all very interesting. I mean, you can look around, you see the crazy world around us. But that's it. That's much shorter than our virus live stream, which we did. But we had a lot more numbers and funny stuff to go through there. This is pretty much straight to the point. We have refuted Marxism. I don't know if anyone has any questions in the chat box, or if anyone would like to discuss anything. Heck, if you have my phone number, which you probably don't, you could give me a shout, and we could talk about Marxism here. But I think we're probably ready to wrap up. Just maybe some notes before we go. So for the secret meetings, which again you're probably aware of if you're watching this, although there might be some new people or something. Let's see, the secret meetings at kind of the pub night, those are normal, every fourth Tuesday of the month. The secret meetings at the secret club, where we do the educational presentations, that's supposed to be on the second Wednesday of every month, and of course our venue has been closed down because of the virus panic, and it's very hard to find an accommodating venue that kind of lets us do what we need to do because of all these virus panic regulations, which limit the kind of groups you can have and stuff. It's pretty annoying. We hope to get that going again soon. I hope it doesn't take too long, but yeah, the winter's looking pretty bad for all that stuff. Okay, so Marxism. We'll probably talk about cultural Marxism, or maybe post-Marxism at some point. but not today, of course. This is mainly an economic thing. We have refuted Marxist economics, and I hope you feel good about it. You can go back and watch this stream anytime. I'm going to keep it around forever, basically. It'll be saved on the RTube channel, MyTube, YouTube, and you can always refer to it. Okay, question in the chat box asking, could you expand on appropriation in terms of value generation? Yes, let's rewind way back. Sorry, this is going to take a little while. I just want to go to kind of what our friend asking the question is referring to. It's going to take some time. I wish there was a faster way to do it. Maybe I'm doing it wrong. I'm dumb. I don't know how to use computers. Oh, we're almost there. Almost there. This must be painful to watch. I'm sorry, everybody. Doot-de-doo. Doot-de-doo. Okay, well, anyway, I can start talking about what he's talking about is when I stated the premises at the beginning here. There's three ways to produce wealth: appropriation, production, and exchange. The question is about appropriation. What does that mean in terms of value creation? Why is that a way of producing wealth? Okay, so an economic good is basically something that is acted upon by a human, that comes into the sphere of human choice. So like a rock on Neptune is not an economic good. It's not part of human action. No one recognizes its scarcity, and no one is bringing it into human activity, so to speak. We talked about contrasting the Marxist idea with the subjectivist idea. Marx is saying there's some objective factor that goes into determining the price, which is interesting because it doesn't explain why there's a price of something that hasn't had any labor necessarily applied to it at all, or at least raw materials that haven't been appropriated. But appropriation takes something where it's not scarce, it's not an economic good, it's not subject to human activity, and brings it into, again, as I would describe, the sphere of human action. So let's say I go, cut down a tree, or I act with regards to a tree to protect it or do whatever. Then it's becoming an economic good. It's subject to someone, in this case my activity, which is scarce and subject to time and choice and all the factors that go into human action. Something that's just out there, not subject to economics or economic activity, isn't really an economic good. And so if you take something that's basically nothing and turn it into an economic good, you're going from kind of 0 to 1, which increases wealth. Imagine Robinson Crusoe alone on his island. He wakes up on a beach. He picks up a stick to use as a tool. Now, before he did that, that stick was not an economic good. But once he does that, he gains a new economic good. His wealth, in both a kind of material and psychical sense, is increased. I hope that explanation helps a little bit. But you could look at, kind of different Austrian economic sources that talk about homesteading or appropriation. I don't know if there's any other questions, but we talked about Marx today, and we'll do some more live streams in the future. For today, let's leave off looking at our friends at the Young Communist League of Alberta. Your future Marxist overlords, I'm sure. They've got their fist in the air. That's what the Marxists do. Well, peace, everyone. That's it. I had a good time. I hope you enjoyed yourselves. This live stream will be saved forever, and I'm rambling. Just gonna call her quits now. Really appreciate everyone who stuck around or dropped in partway through, and we will talk to you later.